The sled glided through snow so deep it would swallow a man to his chest, loaded with supplies that should have been impossible to move. Abel Cartwright leaned into the rope harness, his breath forming ice crystals in the -70-degree air, and pulled 200 pounds of cargo as if the laws of physics had bent to his will. Other mountain men watched from the trading post window, their faces pressed against frosted glass, trying to understand what they were seeing. What Abel had discovered in the mountains of Colorado during the winter of 1840 would save dozens of lives and change how every trapper, prospector, and settler moved supplies through deep snow for the next 3 decades. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories of frontier innovation and survival move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more unbelievable technique that kept mountain men alive in impossible conditions. The trading post at Red Creek sat in a valley where 3 mountain ranges converged, and on this particular morning in late January of 1842, every man inside had stopped what he was doing to watch the figure approaching through the white wasteland beyond the windows. Abel Cartwright moved steadily through snow that came up past his knees, pulling behind him a wooden sled loaded with leather packs, rolled furs, and supply crates that rose nearly 3 feet high. The rope stretched taut from his chest harness to the front of the sled, and with each step forward, the entire load followed, as if drawn by some invisible force that defied everything the watching trappers understood about winter travel. "That's not possible," muttered James Crawford, a veteran of 15 winters in the Rockies. He had his face pressed so close to the glass that his breath fogged the view. "Snow's 5 feet deep in the drifts. I can't pull half that weight with an empty sled in conditions like this." Beside him, 3 other trappers nodded in silent agreement. They had all tried to move supplies through deep powder snow. They all knew the brutal reality. Sleds sank, runners caught on hidden obstacles, rope harnesses cut into shoulders until men bled, and loads had to be split into multiple trips or simply abandoned until conditions improved. The mathematics of winter hauling were unforgiving. A man could pull perhaps 75 pounds through deep snow on a good day, maybe 100 pounds if he was exceptionally strong and willing to destroy his body in the process. But 200 pounds? Through 5-foot drifts? In cold so severe that exposed skin froze in minutes? Abel drew closer, and the men could see details that made the feat even more confusing. He wasn't moving slowly, wasn't stopping every few yards to rest, wasn't showing the desperate, struggling motion that characterized impossible loads. His movement was steady, rhythmic, almost mechanical. He leaned forward at a specific angle, the rope running from his chest harness in a perfectly straight line to the front of the sled, and each step forward brought the entire load gliding behind him as if the snow beneath had turned to ice. "He's using some kind of trick," said Crawford, but his voice carried doubt. "Has to be." The other trappers murmured agreement, but none of them could identify what the trick might be. They could see the sled clearly now. It looked like a sled. Wood runners, flat cargo bed, supplies lashed down with rope. Nothing magical, nothing that explained what they were witnessing. Abel reached the cleared area around the trading post and pulled his load right up to the front steps before stopping, unhooking his harness, and brushing snow from his beard as casually as if he had just walked across a city street. "Morning," he said, nodding to the faces in the window. "Anyone need anything hauled?" 3 years earlier, in the brutal winter of 1839, Abel Cartwright had learned what failure cost in the Rocky Mountains. He and his partner, Henrik Larson, had pushed their trapping season too late, gambling that 1 more week would fill their remaining traps with enough beaver pelts to make the winter truly profitable. They had been in the mountains for 7 months, living in a small cabin near the headwaters of the Blue River, and their collection of furs represented everything they had worked for since spring. Nearly 300 pelts, carefully processed and bundled, worth enough money to set both men up comfortably for 2 years if they could get them to market. The blizzard came on November 9th, 3 weeks earlier than any storm either man had experienced. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. Snow fell so thick that visibility disappeared beyond 10 feet. They had been checking their trap lines when the weather turned, and by the time they made it back to their cabin, both men knew they were in serious trouble. The trading post at Red Creek was 18 miles away through terrain that would now be buried under multiple feet of snow. Their food supplies would last perhaps 2 weeks if they were careful. Their firewood would run out sooner. We waited out. Henrik had said that first night, watching snow pile against the cabin window, "Storm will pass. We make the journey when it clears." But the storm didn't pass. It continued for 6 days, dumping snow that accumulated in drifts higher than a man could reach. When the weather finally broke on November 15th, Abel and Henrik stepped outside to find their world transformed into a white nightmare. The snow measured 5 feet deep in the protected areas and formed drifts twice that height anywhere the wind had blown. Their sled, which they had left leaning against the cabin wall, was completely buried. It took them 2 hours to dig it out and another hour to load it with their bundled pelts and essential supplies. The sled weighed approximately 250 pounds when fully loaded. They had pulled similar weights before, but never through snow this deep. The moment they tried to move it, they understood the terrible mathematics they faced. The sled sank immediately, its runners disappearing into the powder. The front caught on hidden obstacles. Every step forward required both men pulling with all their strength, and even then, they gained perhaps 2 feet before having to stop and rest. At this pace, the 18-mile journey to Red Creek would take days, possibly a week. They didn't have a week. "We split the load," Abel suggested. "Take half now, come back for the rest." "That's 4 trips total through this snow," Henrik said. "We won't make it." They argued for 20 minutes before deciding to try the full load together. If they could just reach Red Creek once, they would survive. They set out at dawn on November 16th, pulling together, and made it less than 2 miles before Henrik collapsed. Henrik Larsson died on November 17, 1839, approximately 3 miles from their cabin and 15 miles from safety. Abel buried him in a shallow snow grave, marking the spot with a crude cross fashioned from broken sled runners, and continued alone with a drastically lightened load. He abandoned the pelts, taking only food and survival gear, and barely made it to Red Creek alive. The frostbite cost him 2 toes on his left foot and nearly his life. When spring came, and he returned to retrieve Henrik's body for proper burial, the guilt settled into his bones like an infection that would never fully heal. Other trappers told him to let it go, that Henrik's death was simply bad luck and worse weather, the kind of tragedy that claimed men in the mountains every winter. But Abel couldn't accept that answer. There had to be a way to move heavy loads through deep snow. Someone just needed to figure it out. He spent the spring and summer of 1840 studying every sled design he could find, talking to French-Canadian voyageurs who used carrioles, Norwegian immigrants who described their traditional akjas, and native tribes who had been building toboggans for centuries before white men arrived. By June, he had collected 7 different sled designs and built versions of each one in a meadow near Red Creek where other trappers could watch his experiments with bemused tolerance. He tested each sled with progressively heavier loads, dragging them through mud to simulate snow resistance, measuring how much weight he could pull before the design failed. The French carriole worked well on packed trails but sank in powder. The Norwegian akja distributed weight better but caught on obstacles. The native toboggan rode highest but lacked structural strength for heavy loads. Abel filled notebooks with sketches and measurements, documenting what worked and what failed. He tried wider runners, narrower runners, different wood types, various upturned front designs. He experimented with coating the bottom in different substances: animal fat, pine sap, beeswax, combinations of all 3. Some treatments worked better than others, but nothing solved the fundamental problem. Every sled eventually sank into deep powder under heavy weight. The physics seemed insurmountable. "You're wasting your time," James Crawford told him in August. "Men have been building sleds for 1,000 years. If there was a better way, someone would have found it." Other trappers agreed. Abel's obsession became a source of gentle mockery around Red Creek. Men would ask if he had invented a flying sled yet, or suggest he just train a team of dogs like sensible people. His reputation as a competent trapper suffered as he devoted more time to his experiments than to actual trapping. By September, he had tested 19 different sled designs and failed with every single one. The snow would return in 2 months, and he was no closer to an answer than when he started. But he kept the notebooks, kept measuring, kept thinking about friction and weight distribution and the terrible morning when Henrik had fallen into the snow and never gotten back up. The breakthrough came in early October of 1840, not from deliberate experimentation, but from 3 separate observations that Abel made within the span of 2 weeks. The first occurred while he was butchering an elk he had shot near the timber line above Red Creek. He had field-dressed the animal and was dragging the hide back to his camp when he noticed something peculiar. The hide slid across a patch of early snow with almost no resistance when the fat side faced downward, but caught and dragged heavily when he accidentally flipped it fur side down. He stopped, tested it multiple times, and realized the rendered fat created a slick surface that somehow reduced friction against the snow crystals. The second observation happened while he was gathering firewood in a stand of aspen and spruce. A dead branch had fallen across a snow-covered log, and when Abel tried to move it, the branch slid sideways with surprising ease. He examined both pieces of wood carefully. The branch had a smooth, resinous surface where pine sap had hardened over time. The texture felt almost waxy under his fingers. He broke off a piece and rubbed it against snow, watching how it glided rather than caught. The natural resin coating, combined with the wood's smooth grain, created a surface that snow couldn't grip effectively. The third observation was the simplest and perhaps the most important. Abel was watching a group of Ute children playing on a hillside near the trading post, sliding down slopes on small toboggans their parents had made. Most of the sleds performed similarly, but one child's toboggan consistently went faster and farther than the others. Abel walked closer to investigate and noticed the front curve of the faster sled rose much higher than traditional designs, creating an exaggerated upturn that seemed almost comical. But the physics were undeniable. While other sleds plowed into snow at the bottom of the hill, this one rode up and over obstacles, maintaining momentum. Abel spent that entire evening sitting by his fire, thinking about those 3 observations. Fat reduced friction. Resin created a slick surface. A steep front curve helped sleds rise over obstacles rather than plow through them. Separately, each observation was interesting, but not revolutionary. Together, they suggested something that made his hands shake as he reached for his notebook. What if the problem wasn't the sled design itself, but the surface interaction between the sled and the snow? What if generations of sled builders had been focused on structural strength when they should have been thinking about friction, reduction, and flotation? He sketched late into the night, designing a sled that incorporated all 3 principles: wide runners for weight distribution, an aggressive front upturn for riding over powder, and a bottom surface treated with a carefully prepared mixture that would create minimum friction against snow crystals. It looked different from any sled he had seen before, almost radical in its proportions. But the logic felt solid. He would need to test it, of course. But for the first time since Henrik's death, Abel felt something approaching hope. Abel began construction on October 23, 1840, selecting his materials with a precision that bordered on obsessive. He spent 3 full days walking through the forests around Red Creek, examining trees until he found exactly what he needed: a tall spruce with tight growth rings that indicated slow, dense growth in poor soil. The wood would be strong but lightweight, and its natural resin content would help with the surface treatment he planned. He felled the tree himself, cut it into manageable sections, and spent a week splitting and planing the wood into runners and crossbeams. The sled's dimensions emerged from careful calculation rather than traditional patterns. He made the runners 4 inches wide instead of the standard 3, spacing them 30 inches apart rather than 24. The increased width would distribute weight across more surface area, reducing how deeply the sled sank into powder. The wider spacing would improve stability and make the sled harder to tip when crossing uneven terrain. Every measurement was deliberate, based on months of failed experiments that had taught him exactly what didn't work. The front upturn required the most careful work. Abel soaked the front sections of both runners in hot water for 2 days, then slowly bent them upward using a system of ropes and stakes, checking the curve repeatedly against a template he had carved. Traditional sleds curved upward perhaps 6 inches. Abel's design rose 14 inches, creating an aggressive angle that looked almost absurd. But he had watched the Ute child's toboggan ride over obstacles, and he trusted the physics even if the appearance seemed wrong. He joined the runners with crossbeams, using wooden pegs he had carved to fit precisely, reinforcing each joint with rawhide lashing that would hold even in extreme cold. The cargo bed consisted of thin planks laid perpendicular to the runners, spaced slightly apart to reduce weight while maintaining strength. The entire structure, when complete, weighed 32 pounds, lighter than most sleds but stronger due to its careful engineering. The bottom treatment took another week of experimentation. Abel rendered bear fat he had saved from a kill the previous month, mixing it with beeswax he had traded for at the post and pine resin he had collected from damaged trees. The proportions mattered. Too much fat and the mixture would be too soft in warmer weather. Too much wax and it would crack in extreme cold. Too much resin and it would become brittle. He tested different ratios on scrap wood, finally settling on a mixture of roughly equal parts that created a coating both slick and durable. He applied 3 layers to the sled's bottom, allowing each coat to dry completely before adding the next. The final surface had a smooth, slightly waxy feel that seemed to repel moisture. When he dragged his hand across it, his skin slid with almost no resistance. Other trappers watched his work with polite skepticism, making jokes about his fancy sled that would probably fall apart the first time he loaded it. Abel ignored them and kept working, driven by the memory of Henrik dying in the snow. Abel completed the sled in mid-November, just as the first serious snows began falling, but he quickly realized the sled itself was only half the solution. On his first test with a moderate load, he discovered that standard rope pulling techniques created serious problems. When he pulled from a short rope attached to his hands, the sled's front end lifted while the back sank deeper into snow, destroying any flotation advantage. When he used a traditional shoulder harness with rope running over his back, the pull angle was wrong and his shoulders took brutal punishment after only a few hundred yards. He needed a completely different approach to how force transferred from his body to the sled. Abel spent 2 weeks experimenting with various harness designs, rope lengths, and attachment points. He tried chest harnesses, waist harnesses, combinations of both. He varied rope length from 6 feet to 20 feet, measuring how each distance affected pull angle and mechanical advantage. He discovered that longer ropes allowed him to lean forward at a more efficient angle, using his leg muscles and body weight rather than just arm and shoulder strength. The breakthrough came when he realized he was thinking about the problem backward. He didn't need to pull harder. He needed to pull smarter, using his entire body as a lever system that multiplied force without requiring more effort. A rope length of 15 feet proved optimal, allowing him to lean forward at approximately a 30-degree angle where his legs drove the motion and his core muscles stabilized the load. At that angle, every step forward translated directly into forward sled movement without wasting energy, lifting, or fighting the rope. The chest harness design took multiple iterations before Abel found something that worked. He created a wide band that distributed pressure across his chest and shoulders, preventing the rope from cutting into any single pressure point. The harness attached to the main rope through a metal ring he had purchased at the trading post, allowing the rope to pivot and adjust angle as terrain changed. This flexibility prevented the rigid pulling that had characterized his failed experiments. But the most important innovation came at the sled's attachment point. Abel added a horizontal crossbar to the sled's front, mounted perpendicular to the runners and extending slightly beyond them on each side. The main pull rope attached to the center of this crossbar, creating a system that distributed tension evenly across both runners simultaneously. When Abel pulled, the force spread equally to both sides of the sled, preventing the twisting and uneven sinking that plagued traditional designs where rope attached to a single point. The complete system, sled plus rope plus harness, represented something fundamentally different from conventional winter hauling methods. It wasn't one innovation, but rather multiple small improvements that worked together, each element supporting the others. Abel stood in the snow outside his cabin on November 28th, looking at the finished product, and felt the same nervousness he imagined an inventor might feel before testing a machine that existed only in theory. Tomorrow, he would load the sled and find out if his months of work had produced something revolutionary or just another failure. The snow fell steadily on December 3rd, 1840, accumulating in the kind of deep powder that made winter travel treacherous. By mid-morning, drifts measured 4 feet in the protected areas and significantly deeper where wind had pushed snow into gullies and depressions. Abel stood outside the trading post at Red Creek, methodically loading his new sled, while a growing crowd of trappers gathered to watch what most expected would be an entertaining failure. Word had spread about his experimental design, and men who normally wouldn't waste time on such things had found excuses to be present. "That's too much weight," said James Crawford, watching Abel add another bundle of supplies to the growing pile. "You'll sink before you make it 50 yards. Abel continued loading without responding. He added packed furs, supply crates, tools wrapped in canvas, dried food in leather bags. When he finished, the load rose nearly 3 feet above the sled bed and represented approximately 200 pounds of cargo, more than any man would attempt to pull through deep snow under normal circumstances. He checked the lashing multiple times, ensuring nothing would shift or fall during movement, then turned to face the assembled trappers. "I'm heading to the high camp above Timber Creek," he announced. 6 miles through that." He gestured toward the white expanse beyond the trading post, where virgin snow stretched unbroken toward the distant tree line. "Anyone wants to follow and see if this works, you're welcome." 8 men accepted the invitation, some out of genuine curiosity, others simply because they had nothing better to do on a snowy morning. They followed at a distance as Abel fitted his chest harness, attached the long rope to the sled's crossbar, and adjusted everything until the system sat exactly as he had designed it. He took a deep breath, leaned forward at the precise angle he had practiced, and took his first step. The sled moved. Not easily, not without resistance, but it moved forward in a smooth glide that made several of the watching trappers involuntarily take a step closer. Abel took another step, and another, establishing a steady rhythm that pulled the loaded sled behind him like something on wheels, rather than something being dragged through deep powder. The runners floated on top of the snow rather than sinking, the treated bottom sliding with minimal friction, and the long rope kept the pull angle optimal. "Well, I'll be damned," someone muttered. Abel continued for 100 yards, then 200, maintaining the same steady pace without stopping to rest. The trappers followed, now genuinely interested, watching how the sled performed as Abel encountered deeper drifts and minor terrain changes. The aggressive front upturn rode over obstacles that would have caught conventional sleds. The wide runner spacing kept the load stable. The harness system distributed effort across Abel's entire body rather than destroying his shoulders. By the time he reached a half mile, every man present understood they were witnessing something significant. Crawford caught up to walk beside Abel, studying the sled's movement with the intensity of someone watching money being made. "How much you want for the design?" he asked. Abel never sold the design because 6 weeks after his successful demonstration, circumstances arose that made personal profit seem small and selfish. On January 19, 1841, a prospector named William Hendricks arrived at Red Creek on foot, half frozen and desperate, reporting that his wife and 2 young children were stranded at their remote claim 15 miles north into the mountains. A sudden blizzard had trapped them 3 days earlier, with minimal food and firewood running low. Hendricks had attempted to bring them out on foot, but the children couldn't walk through snow that deep, and his wife was recovering from illness that left her too weak for the journey. "Someone has to get supplies to them," Hendricks pleaded to the gathered men at the trading post. "My boy is 6 years old. My daughter is 4. They won't last another 2 days in that cold." The trappers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Everyone understood the situation, and everyone knew the terrible math involved. 15 miles through 5-foot snow drifts in sub-zero temperatures, carrying enough supplies to matter, then 15 miles back. It would take multiple days, require multiple men, and even then, success was far from guaranteed. Several men volunteered immediately, willing to try despite the odds, but their planning session quickly revealed the central problem. They couldn't carry enough supplies through that snow to make the journey worthwhile. "I can get there," Abel said quietly. All heads turned toward him. "With my sled, I can haul enough food and firewood to keep them alive until the weather breaks. I can make it there and back in one trip." The room erupted in discussion. Some men thought he was being recklessly overconfident. Others argued that his sled had only been tested on a 6-mile journey with optimal conditions, not 15 miles through a blizzard zone. But Hendricks looked at Abel with desperate hope, and Abel remembered Henrik dying in the snow while he stood helpless. If his innovation couldn't save lives, what was the point? He loaded the sled carefully. Dried meat, hardtack, flour, coffee, matches in a waterproof container, blankets, a small axe, and enough cut firewood to last 3 days. The load weighed nearly 220 pounds. He added a buffalo robe that would provide additional warmth and a skin of whiskey for medicinal purposes. Hendricks drew him a detailed map showing landmarks and the approximate location of the claim. Abel studied it until he could visualize the route, then set out at dawn on January 20th with 8 hours of daylight ahead of him. The journey became a test of every principle he had engineered into his design. Deep drifts that would have stopped. Conventional sleds merely slowed his progress. The treated runners glided over crusty snow that would have caught standard wood. The long rope and harness system let him maintain steady forward motion even when exhaustion tried to overwhelm him. He pulled for hours, stopped only briefly to drink water and check his direction, then pulled again. As darkness approached, he saw smoke rising from a distant cabin and knew he had made it. The Hendricks family survived, and Abel made it back to Red Creek 36 hours after he had departed, exhausted but alive. Word of the rescue spread through the Rocky Mountain trapping community with the speed that important news always traveled in isolated regions, where survival information meant the difference between life and death. By February of 1841, trappers from 3 different valleys had arrived at Red Creek specifically to examine Abel's sled design and learn how he had accomplished what everyone considered impossible. Abel shared everything freely. He showed them the runner width, the spacing, the aggressive front upturn that looked comical but performed brilliantly. He explained the bottom treatment mixture, giving exact proportions of bear fat, beeswax, and pine resin. He demonstrated the rope length, the harness design, the crossbar attachment system that distributed pulling force evenly. He let men examine every detail, take measurements, ask questions about construction techniques and material selection. Some trappers took notes. Others simply studied the sled with their hands, memorizing through touch what their eyes observed. "Why give this away?" asked a French-Canadian voyageur who had traveled from the north specifically to see the innovation. "You could charge men for this knowledge. Make good money." Abel thought about Hendricks' frozen body, about the Hendricks children who would have died without intervention, about all the men who had been killed over the years by winter conditions that better equipment might have helped them survive. "Knowledge that saves lives shouldn't have a price," he said. "Build your own sleds, teach others. That's payment enough." Throughout the spring and summer of 1841, Abel helped more than 20 men build improved sleds, refining his teaching methods as he went. He discovered that certain woods worked better than others depending on what was locally available. He learned that the bottom treatment could be modified for different temperature ranges, using more wax for extreme cold and more fat for milder conditions. He found that the rope length needed adjustment based on a man's height and leg length, with taller men benefiting from slightly longer ropes that optimized their natural stride. By winter of 1841-42, approximately 30 sleds built using Abel's principles were operating across the Rocky Mountain region. The results were dramatic and immediately measurable. Supply runs that previously required multiple trips could now be accomplished in one journey. Trappers who had avoided winter travel unless absolutely necessary began moving goods regularly. Trading posts reported increased winter business because men could transport furs and supplies regardless of snow depth. Most importantly, the winter mortality rate among trappers dropped noticeably in areas where the improved sleds were common. The design continued evolving as different builders added their own modifications. Some men added side rails to better secure cargo. Others experimented with different runner shapes for specific terrain types. A Norwegian trapper incorporated elements from traditional Akja designs, creating a hybrid that worked exceptionally well in steep mountain passes. But all variations maintained Abel's core principles: wide runners, aggressive front upturn, treated bottom surface, and long rope harness system. The fundamental physics he had discovered remained constant even as specific implementations adapted to local needs and preferences. The scene at Red Creek Trading Post on that January morning in 1842, where this story began, represented the culmination of Abel's work becoming standard practice. As he pulled his heavily loaded sled up to the front steps and unhitched his harness, the trappers who had gathered at the windows no longer looked confused or skeptical. They looked at a technique they recognized, understood, and many of them had already adopted for their own use. James Crawford stepped outside and helped Abel secure the sled, nodding with the casual respect that men show when someone has solved a problem that benefits everyone. "You heading back up to Timber Creek?" Crawford asked. "After I resupply," Abel replied. "Should make it before dark if the weather holds." That simple exchange captured everything that had changed. A journey that would have been considered suicidal 3 years earlier had become merely difficult but manageable. Abel's innovation hadn't eliminated the dangers of Rocky Mountain winters, but it had reduced them to a level where competent men with proper equipment could survive and even prosper. The impossible had become routine through careful observation, persistent experimentation, and a willingness to share knowledge freely. By 1850, variations of Abel's sled design were standard across the western frontier. Settlers moving into Oregon Territory used improved sleds to transport supplies through mountain passes. Prospectors in California goldfields adapted the principles for moving equipment through Sierra Nevada snow. Military expeditions ordered sleds built to Abel's specifications for winter operations. The design spread organically because it solved real problems better than any alternative, and because Abel had refused to restrict the knowledge through patents or profit-seeking. Modern engineering analysis reveals why the system worked so effectively. The wide runners distributed weight across approximately 240 square inches of surface area compared to roughly 120 square inches for traditional designs, cutting snow penetration by half. The treated bottom reduced friction coefficient by approximately 35% compared to untreated wood. The aggressive front upturn created a wedge angle that lifted the sled over obstacles rather than plowing through them. The long rope and chest harness converted pulling motion into efficient forward force, utilizing leg muscles that were 3 times stronger than arm and shoulder muscles. Each element contributed measurable improvement, and together they created performance that exceeded the sum of individual parts. Abel Cartwright continued trapping until 1848, then settled in the Montana Territory, where he raised horses and ran a small trading operation. He died in 1873 at age 61, respected in his community, but largely unknown beyond it. His obituary in the territorial newspaper mentioned his years as a mountain man, but said nothing about the sled design that had saved dozens of lives. Yet his legacy remained tangible in the mountains, carved not in monuments or written in history books, but expressed through the simple fact that men could move supplies through deep snow when previous generations could not. Innovation driven by tragedy, refined through failure, and shared freely because survival mattered more than profit. That was Abel Cartwright's gift to the frontier, and it endured long after his name was forgotten.